Okay, it's being live streamed. Hello, I'm going to wait until this just quickly opens up so I can make sure that we don't hear it. And here we go. Hello and welcome to episode 100 of Jung at Harp. Today we are going to talk about the power of myth in our lives, and we're talking about it in conjunction with my show, The Golden Cage. So we call this Jung at Harp meets The Golden Cage. I am Deborah Henson-Conant. I'm a composer and a performer. I'm here with Kathleen Wiley, who is a Jungian psychoanalyst, and each week, we take a subject, actually not a subject, a question that we want to ask, and we bring it to each other, and we ask that question and invite you into that conversation. So Kathleen, right now in my life, The Golden Cage, which is a show I've been working on for 40 years, and that just previewed in New York City in April, and now the point was to get it videotaped to work in collaboration with the Streaming Musicals Network so that it will be released on video in December. And right now I'm working on a project about the Golden Cage called Unlocking the Golden Cage, which is looking at the themes of that show and getting into conversation with experts in different fields and finding out, where does that theme fit in your life and in your work? And you picked today the theme to start with, the theme of myths.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. One of the linchpins, one of the foundational pillars of Jungian psychology is looking at what myths and fairy tales, religious stories tell us about how psyche works, about how our inner life flows and is activated. And so stories give us pictures of the inner world and how things move. And, throughout all cultures, there's a body of folklore, whether it's the myths that have been written down, the fairy tales that have been written down, or those that just gets passed down orally. And being aware of those myths and those themes can help us understand what's going on in our life. And for you, The Golden Cage was written originally when you were 19 years old, at a time when, my guess, your psyche was putting something down on paper that was yet to unfold in your life. And in a way, we can look at this myth as kind of information and a blueprint of what's going to happen. And that is indeed what all myths give us. And if we have those blueprints and we understand how our personal blueprint or story interfaces with collective stories, it helps us understand ourselves. And understanding goes a long way toward being able to be compassionate and supportive with ourselves instead of getting judgmental and nasty with ourselves.
It's funny that you're saying this, because I'm thinking about the moment that the story emerged, and then I'm thinking about how the story unfolded in my life. And so it emerged because I was 19 and I was sitting at the piano, where I always was, and I asked myself the question: is my life going to be a life of security or of freedom? Am I going to be searching for security, or am I going to be searching for freedom? And in that moment, an image came. And that image was of two characters, two beings on either side of the bars of a cage. And one could fly and the other one is stuck inside the cage. And this happened really just in an instant. And then they started singing this song to each other. Here I am in my golden cage, so secure and so pure. There you are on the outside looking in. And then the other one sings, there you are, here I am at your palace gate in a state of despair. There you are on the inside looking out. And what I'm thinking about today is it's so interesting, because I think I was just working with someone in technology recently who was doing some technology work for me, and we'd agreed that she would write a plan for what she was going to do. And in fact, that never happened. She just started working. And when we were talking about it afterwards, she said, no, that was my plan. My plan, my plan was created in this form of within the technology. And I was like, oh, interesting. So each of us will create our plan in the mode that in the language we speak, and the language that I have spoken since I was a child, is stories with music. So
Mhm.
immediately that schematic, that question, that plan, that what I was working out became a story with music. And then what I'm interested in is, how did it then become a myth? Why
Mhm.
is it mythical? I get that it is.
Right, right. Yeah, that's a good question. And and I'm not so sure I can answer that,
Goody! That's
except
one of my favorite questions.
except to say that the theme, this choice of do I have security or do I have freedom, both represent energies that are bigger than our ego consciousness. They're what Jung would talk about as archetypal and or instinctive energies, meaning that innate within each of us, inborn within each of us, is this desire for freedom, an energy that wants that, and desire for security, an energy that wants that. And each of those energies have a life of their own because they are instinctive and archetypal, meaning they're universal currents in the river we're all in. And then we each engage with those universal energies in our own way. And when we get to talking about security, we have to bring into the conversation, or at least I do, Abraham Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Abraham Maslow said there are 5 basic human needs. The first is trust or mistrust. The second is safety. The third is love and belonging. The fourth is self-esteem. And the fifth is self-actualization. And I'm sorry, I said the first level of need was trust. That's an Erickson psychosocial model. I'm thinking security. The first level of need in Maslow's hierarchy is our physical needs have to be met. We have to have food, shelter, the things that will
Oh,
literally
got it.
physically keep us alive. Then we have to have our safety needs met, which means we have to know wild animals aren't going to devour us when we sleep. But for us human beings, safety also means emotional safety. It means knowing that we're not going to be annihilated by someone's words or their harsh attitude toward us. And, young children, and we may have all seen this, and some of us may have been on the receiving end when we were 2 or 3, having caregivers or teachers, people around us who responded to something that we did playfully and creatively that may have made a mess for them in a way where we just felt totally wiped out. We felt totally annihilated. There wasn't a safety of self. So safety and security to me, I think we have to talk about them together because we have to differentiate what is the safety that we all need in order to be able to have love and belonging and self-esteem. Because Maslow says you can't have the higher level need until the lower level need is met. So you can't feel a sense of love and belonging with someone if you don't feel safe with them. And you
Right.
can't feel a sense of self-esteem and value if you don't feel love and belonging within yourself. So the needs build on one another. So we have to be able to distinguish what is the safety that we need, and then what is the security that we long for that can turn into a cage that actually
Right.
keeps us trapped. And
Yeah, because that's the next part of the theme was from the very beginning I understood that the cage was also a home, that it was
Mhm.
a home um, when the bars are not when I'm not locked inside, or when the character's not locked inside, it becomes a home, and she actually experiences it. The character's gender is neither here nor there. They actually were originally they were just called A and B because they were 2 parts of me, and then I started calling them Alpha and Beta, and then then when we performed the show, I turned them into Althea and Boris. but that was the so the one on the inside, I was very aware from the beginning. So as the show created itself, or the myth or whatever it was created itself, there were things I understood, but many things I didn't understand. I understood that it was both a home and a cage in different conditions of being.
Right.
I understood that there would ultimately be freedom for her, and but I didn't understand how that would happen. And in the beginning, I was, for many years, one of the reasons that I could not move further with the show is that I couldn't accept that that she would need help. I don't know. How much does that admit about me? It was like, no, she must be able to do it herself. She has to figure it out. And I think the only, it wouldn't, and I think it would not have been possible for me to complete the show and allow it to actually have the conclusion that it has until I got to a certain point of my life. So for me, and I would wish this for anybody, to have a question or a project that is a lifelong question or project that you do not finish early on, but that you get to live your whole life through. And I'm sure that I will continue to live my life through, with the show will open up maps and understanding for me throughout my life. But it's been really interesting to watch it unfold, not know the answers, not know how the myth goes.
Right. Yeah. So, the beautiful thing about fairy tales and myths and stories, when we hear them, when they've already finished, is they show us a trajectory. And it's like, okay, so this is one possibility. And then maybe another fairy tale has another possibility. And it shows different ways of getting to the same end sometimes. And so the beautiful thing about the collective stories that we have and the stories that we share, and when we share our personal stories with each other, is it helps us all see more of the possibilities of life. Because what can become a cage for any of us is when we have tunnel vision. We think this is the only way. And what you just said about you couldn't finish the story for a long time because you were determined Althea had to get out on her own by herself. And from a psychological point of view, I think about how people come into my office, they start analysis usually because they've finally gotten it. Their ego alone cannot figure it out, that there's this whole other side of themselves that they are going to have to open up to engage with and to begin to listen to, and that may actually have superior answers. And Jung says that. He says that the unconscious may actually have answers and information that is superior to the conscious attitude. But our ego, just like you at 19, and most 19-year-olds, they want to, I can do it all by myself. I need nothing else from anywhere, any source.
And by the way, this went on for many decades, not just at 19.
Well, and at some point you grew out of that. We could talk about it that way. You expanded. You realized, this isn't working the way that I thought it would. It's getting me some of what I want, but I'm not getting everything that I want.
Well, it's really interesting because there was a time about 4 or 5 years ago when I met a friend, someone who's become a friend. And in our very first conversation, and I don't know how this happened, he said something like, are you happy with your life? And I was like, well, I'm frustrated. And he was like, with what? And I was like, well, the golden cage. And I explained a little of the story. And at that point, it was just a bunch of papers that had been performed a couple of times, but I knew that it wasn't complete. And he said, well, would you be happy if it was on Broadway? And I was like, no, that's not it. I would be happy if I were working on it for 30 minutes each day. Uh-huh. And he said, okay, that's it. I'm holding you to that. You're going to send me a message by midnight each day that you've worked for 30 minutes on it. And so I did. I sent him a picture of whatever I'd worked on. I texted it to him at the end of every day. And I just remember one day when I was still working. I started late and I got a text saying, you will burn in hell if you do not send me that. And I had this moment of realizing, wow, someone really is looking out for my commitment to this show. And that was when the theme of being helped and being pushed came into the show itself. It
Oh,
didn't exist before then.
that gives me chilly bumps because I just had this image, thinking analytically as a Jungian analyst. Here was this outer world placeholder of Boris who shows up outside the golden cage and says, you can pull these bars loose. And he starts pulling the bars out, And this is the power of myth and story for us, and how our inner worlds and outer worlds do interrelate, they intertwine. There's no way to separate our inner growth and our movement to wholeness from our outer world relationships. And that is a beautiful example of that. For those of you who haven't seen the show yet, but you'll get to, when someone shows up and says, oh yeah, but you can move out of this cage. You don't have to stay stuck in here. And they can see something we can't. And
Right.
your
And
friend,
for everybody who understands, Boris is not selfless. He doesn't selflessly come there. He's actually, when he pulls the bars out, he's got his own very, very strong ulterior motives. Just to be
well, yeah,
just
but you're making another point that altruism is a high level defense on the Milan scale of ego defenses.
I do not even know what that sentence means.
Everything we do has something in it for us. And that is part of the shadow side of being a human being, that it is not me or you, but it's both. It's
I
both
see.
and.
Right.
And when we can understand that, we go a long way toward psychological maturity and wholeness, and being able to realize how we impact other people, because we impact each other. That's another whole path
Yeah,
we
I'm
could go
thinking that
down.
my brain is like, hey, I want to ask about that. And I was like, you know what? That's what you do. Let's come back here.
Yeah.
So let's come back to the power of myth. So one of the things that you were talking about our outside and our inside, the sense that I got when you were saying that is that those two things work together and they create a resonance. And the stories that we tell on the inside and the actual illustrations that we make of them on the outside, they do reflect each other. And I get that in this musical, in this myth of the golden cage, Althea, who is inside the cage and wants out, and Boris is out on the outside and wants in. And when Althea is in, to her it appears to be made out of cement and iron. And it doesn't just appear that way. It literally is when she's on the inside. And it's always interesting and she keeps generating that thought. These are the questions I still have about it. If she actually was able to change her vision that this cage is made out of cement and iron, if she could change the way she saw it, would she be free? But then would she have the courage to do what she has to do next in order to actually, become what she originally was, become the free, powerful being that she originally was? And in each case, she actually needs something outside herself. Like I have it that once we are stuck inside ourselves, there is no way out unless something else comes in and we reach back.
Yeah, so what you're talking about is perception. It's our perception, our filter through which we experience an object like the cage. That's the defining factor. So on the outside, the cage to Boris looks like something where you can freely come and go as you want. And after all, there are bars with spaces between them. And so things can get in and things can get out. But on the inside, Althea has this filter. It's like she has on colored glasses that distort that ability to move in and out, and that thus block her from accessing it. So
But the
the
question is, is it a filter or is it the condition of the cage? Because it, he looks at it and he's like, but just made of nothing, like, come on, it's made of nothing. But as soon as he's caught, it's just as real to him.
but there's a beautiful line, and I don't know if I should give it away or not.
It's not like well, maybe the entire world is listening to this, but what the
Yes.
heck? Sure.
I mean, there's this beautiful scene at the end, which, is part of what really captured me, where now Boris is in the cage and depressed and despairing and with his dark self, just the state Althea began in. And Althea comes back having flown all over, joyous and alive. And she sees him and she's like, she doesn't say it this way, but she says, come out and play with me. Come out and fly. And he's like, I can't. And she says, oh, but you can. And then she has this aha. And this is how I filtered it. It may not be just the right words. Oh, that's how it happens. It's once you're inside and you lock yourself in, that it becomes the prison of stone and cement. That right there to me is that is the wisdom of the entire myth. That is to me the universal principle that we want to, that, and we see it over and over in various ways, and myths and stories that have been around for centuries. Is when we lock ourselves into something, whether we lock ourselves into an attitude, a belief system, we get locked into a shutdown mode, not feeling and experiencing. When we lock ourselves into any one object, state of consciousness, desire, felt sense, when something gets locked up, this is what happens in trauma. Experiences get locked into the body and they aren't accessible by the adult presence. And so then periodically they intrude, something intrudes, but one can't access it. It's like something gets locked up. And so your question about, is it really the cement and stone, or is it the golden cage with the bars? It's both, but it depends on whether you've locked yourself in it. Correct. Or you still have access to the rest of you and the rest of your life.
And that's for years. I mean, I sensed that, but I wasn't able to give it voice. That was one of the last things that I was writing. And I remember, it being in writing groups, and they were like, well, what is the world of the cage? How does it work? And I was like, no, it really is a cage when you're inside, but and they're like, well, is the cage caging you, or what are you?
Right.
And that I can't, because I believe we are the cage in some way. And so, yes, the cage is caging us. But one of the things I would think was really fascinating was when this was being staged in New York. And I was like, how are we going to do this? Like, I was always imagining, well, maybe there's a scrim and it really does look like like it's a, like this when you're in it, so you can have her experience, and it looks like this on the outside. And when the stage designer finally came up with the design, I was just like, oh my God, I think I started crying, because I was like, oh my God, that is a truth that I just didn't even see. And it was so, it was the stage is made out of feathers. The bars are made out of feathers. And one of the last songs that Althea sings was when she has this realization, is that you build your cage from dreams that died and every heartache that you've ever held inside. You forge the bars from every pain and sorrow you've known. And in your cage, you are alone. And there's a part of the song that got cut from the show that follows when Boris actually was talking about his cage, because his cage was the cage of ambition. He spent his entire life, searching around the world. Met the Sphinx, had a couple drinks, and I was on my way. Out in the dunes, I saw King Tut with his sarcophagus unzipped, and believe me, that was quite a thrill. I've whatever, he's done all these things. I've been rubbing elbows with the cobras in Bombay, whatever he's done. But he doesn't have friends. He's just done all these things, but he just goes away because he was always looking for the one thing. And what got cut from the end, but is there, is he just sings the quest, the flight, the endless night, the taste of glory that you doubt you'll ever know. And all the time you're aching for a trust you fear you'll never find. You're torn, you're tossed. Outside the cage, you're lost. So whether you're inside the cage where you're alone or you're outside the cage where you're lost, you're still isolated. You are still unable to do the one thing that would create actual freedom, which is connection.
Yes. And the play, and often again we see in myth and fairy tale, the connection is with some figure from the outside that shows up in our life and that may originally look undesirable to us. So often in fairy tales, it's the dumbling or the dwarf, the one who
Huh.
the undesirable from a collective standpoint. And so inevitably the first seekers will ignore that person, and then they never find the treasure. And then the one who comes along and honors what it is that energy offers. And it's true for us. And again, in our psyche, from an analytic point of view, we're really talking about, do we pay attention to those things that come up inside of us that we would easily dismiss or not find desirable? And often these kinds of messages come up through us through the body. So, we may start to have heart palpitations, or we may have tension in our stomach. And instead of looking at that as a communication from our larger psyche that wants to give us guidance, we take a pill. We want to get rid of it instead of honoring it. And this is so much for me about my work on embodiment in my online embodiment circle, that we get these messages all the time in our own body mind, and we ignore them. The fantasies that come up and that keep us awake at night, people will say, I want to make those go away. And I'll say, well, the only way they're going to go away is when they're heard. And the message inside of them, no matter how crazy, paranoid, or catastrophic the fantasy seems, you can connect to that bit of yourself that's in it. Then you have that energy to move forward. So we often dismiss the things in our own body mind and in our own psyche that come up as guideposts. And we do encounter them in the outer world, vis-a-vis the people who come along who irritate us, but become the grain of sand that, turns into the pearl, or situations that block us, that cause us to have to slow down and include other aspects of our life.
So let me just pull this back a little bit again to this idea of myth and the quality of myth, and what the quality of myth offers to us, whether we're experiencing it within our bodies as, I mean, in some way, or whether we experience it in a book or we experience it in a musical. I'd like to talk about that, and I'd like to put a pin in an idea that I'm having that I'm not going to ask to do now, even though I really want to do it, which is, what would it look like if Althea and or Boris came to you as a Jungian psychoanalyst? What would that first session be like? We can talk about that another time. But let's come back to, so for me, creating this story that I've lived, I created a powerful myth unintentionally to answer a question in my life. Is this a thing? I mean, I think we do that in dreams. Are there other places that we kind of do that in a more day-to-day way?
Oh, we create a myth every day. Most people just do it unconsciously, So people who wake up and say, "Oh, I've got another day in the salt mines," or, "I have another day where there's no room for me." That's a myth. It's not an elaborate artistic myth like we're talking about with the golden cage, but we're all the time telling ourselves stories that then define how our energies flow throughout the day. And unfortunately, most people do it by default. They do it by thinking about, saying things like, "I'm always so tired," or "I have no energy in the evening." Well, there's another myth. Well, so that happens all the time. There are larger myths that are defining principles. So, for instance, childhood dreams, like one of the things that Jung said is that if you can remember what you could do for hours on end as a child when you were 4 or 5 years old, then in that are probably the seeds of your life's work. So there are larger dreams we have that become overarching myths. Our night dreams, our sleep dreams, which give us snapshots of what's going on in our psyche. Some of those dreams are what I call housekeeping dreams. They're just kind of helping us process what we experienced that day. But there are other dreams, like your waking dream of the golden cage, that's more of a prophetic dream that shows kind of a trajectory of our life. And I'm thinking of a couple of dreams I've had 20 years ago that are still working me. They're like myths that it's showing me this unfolding, this movement, some of which I consciously and cognitively understand now, and some of it that I'm still living into, that I'm still finding exactly all the riches of what the symbols mean. So there are all kinds of myths and stories, and it's important that we pay attention to all of them because they all affect us.
Well, let me ask you something because you were talking about, like if I was like, oh, I'm going to have another hard day. Is
Mhm.
that a myth or is that a lie? What is the difference between a myth and a lie?
Well, that's a good question. Because there are, I mean, we don't think of myths on a collective level when we look at the body of myths throughout cultures. We typically don't think of them as laws, but we think of them as these are, again, snapshots of defining principles and ideas. So, is that a myth or a lie? And do all myths tell the truth? I think that's a good question. I think probably there are myths that show us the distortions or the lies. But at the same time, if in the evening I tend to be tired because I'm working too much, I'm not getting enough fresh air and exercise, there's also a seed of truth in it. I mean, this is another thing that I truly believe as a Jungian
Oh,
analyst.
so a myth is a lie that has truth in it. No, is
I think that everything has a seed of truth, but it's not the whole truth.
Oh God, it's so interesting because I mean I've been using this story I mean I began to realize at a certain point that it was a navigation not it wasn't a navigational device as in and here's where you can go next in your
Mhm,
life, but it's a navigational device in understanding, oh, that's what just happened to me.
mhm,
Oh, I just asked someone to push me off a cliff. Oh, I just saw the ground racing up towards me and
mhm,
I just surrendered.
mhm.
This is actually what I mean, this happens in the show. This is for another talk, which is what
Right.
actually activated her experience of freedom. And so it's helped me. The myth, the story has helped me. And it's also helped me because it's a musical and it's got music and I can sing that music, helps me to express the feelings of what that feels like.
So one of the things I would say as I'm hearing you say that again is that for you this is a religious myth or
Whoa.
spiritual myth.
Uh-huh.
Because it is a myth for you that shows you this larger trajectory and unfoldment towards wholeness. And that is what religious and spiritual myths do. is religious and spiritual myths show us a picture of the unfoldment into our larger self. Large self being the totality of who we are from a Jungian
Yeah.
point of view. And so as we're talking about my saying I'm always tired as a myth, as opposed to this story as a myth, we're talking about different levels of myth that serve different functions. And
Mm.
one of the values of knowing fairy tales and reading stories and reading the stories that have been passed down again cross culturally and where we find common themes is that we can see these larger universal principles and how they unfold in life. And we can see how they unfold to an end that would be desirable, and sometimes how they unfold to ends that are not desirable. And
I see what you're saying, and one of the things that I really see in this moment that I think is so important, and it goes through all my work, is that it allows you to see not a generalization, but an essential thing rather than a specific. By this
yes,
being mythical, that allows me to see many parts of my life layered onto it. And I hear this from many other people who see the show, which is one reason I wanted to unlock it with
mhm,
different people to find out how those themes get, I don't know, how they actually show up in the quote real world versus the world of my fantasy.
right, right. Yeah, I think what you just said is that the themes are it's the essence. The process that's depicted in this nuanced story is the same process that's depicted in the Holy Grail and many other very commonly known myths. It's that what becomes the sought after treasure.
Aha.
And from a Jungian point of view, the sought after treasure truly is union with ourself. It's oneness, it's connection with all bits of ourself, and it's having enough security and enough freedom, but both and instead of either or. And that very much is a part of Jungian psychology. Is when we get caught in the one-sidedness that we get ourselves in trouble. Althea got caught in one-sidedness, and all of a sudden it was a prison of stone and cement.
And Boris
Then
gets stuck in
and
his
Boris gets
outsidedness.
there
Yeah,
too.
right. And it's really fun. And I know we have to come to an end now. I'm just having this personal epiphany today, as you're saying they come together because so as you know, they were two parts of me in the beginning. I named them A and B. And one of the earliest memories that I have is of learning to spell and learning to put letters together. And I remember my mother, she wrote cat and I was like, so wait a second, you just put the letters together and like that creates a word. And she was like, yep, that's how it happens. And I was like, okay, just a second. And I was like, I am going to create the greatest word that ever was. And I was like, put all these letters together and I said, what does this say? And I gave it to her and she looked at it and she said, that says nothing. And I was just crushed when I'd made the greatest word that anyone would make. Um, I think she said, that means nothing. But in this moment, when you said that, it's the two sides of ourselves and they come together, I remembered that moment of when letters create words, and words are the one things humans have invented to make that connection between us, even through long distances. So I I'm just going to sit in this epiphany and also just say this is why I love these conversations with you. And this is and just a plug for conversation as a beautiful art form of finding out of connecting and finding out what is there in any particular thing. So I wish we could go on for 2 more hours. And I want to thank you so much, Kathleen, for bringing your experience as a musician, as a human, and all your life's work studying Jung and as a psychoanalyst to this conversation. And just so much has opened up for me. And I hope that it has for other people who have been listening to this conversation. And I hope that everyone will join us again as we continue to unlock the golden cage and possibly everything else in the world. Thank you.
Bye bye.